Today's Britain feels like a giant totally stuck in the mud, like it's been that way for at least a solid decade. The British have been through it all. The Brexit shock wave, insane post-pandemic inflation, and prime ministers sweeping in and out like socks. But the same thing just keeps happening. Some of those moments still feel like they happened yesterday. But the really fatal step into that swamp wasn't Brexit. To figure out how things went so wrong, we probably need to go back to one summer about 20 years ago. There's a very common conception that I want to clear up, and it might sound a little bit backwards. A lot of y'all think Brexit was where everything started falling apart, but that was already the result. So let's talk about what actually caused it. By the early 1990s, this decline had already taken shape. Life in Britain was quite heavy then. After years of government shutting industries, privatizing state companies, cutting public spending, it basically wiped out whole working class towns and left people jobless with nowhere to go. Thatcher's policies might have trimmed the economy in a way, but the side effects hit people very hard. Arts funding was slashed to almost nothing, and the public services were stretched paper thin. Economically, it was totally giving Ozempic. The weight was gone, sure, but the whole country's cultural spirit was flat like A4 paper. Eventually, all that pressure exploded into a cultural meltdown. The attitude in the British art scene back then was basically, yeah, the society's trash, so I'm gonna be the bad kid and f this word up. The young British artists behaved like some attention-seeking rebel kids, but in a good sense. And whatever looks shocking, they never missed a thing. That whole mix of anger and creativity just needed a spark to blow, just a little bit. That spark was MTV, and also farewell to MTV. It completely changed the game. Suddenly, every British band had a global stage, and obviously this new visual culture spread much faster and hit harder than any newspaper or radio ever could. Oasis, Blur, Pulp, Britpop's whole cocktail of frustration, boredom, and class-soaked rebellion got blasted straight into American teenagers' bedrooms overnight, and to them this stuff felt so fresh and cool. It's like giving a microphone to this generation of British rebels who have felt ignored for so long. This time they shouted, finally someone's actually listening. So in the 1990s, when massive party kicked off, Cool Britannia, Britpop bands, Spice Girls, the outrageous young British artists, all these cultural icons exploded across the world by MTV and glossy magazines. The new Labour government saw this wave coming and served it perfectly, transforming this cultural moment into a weapon for national rebranding. For a moment, it seemed like the whole world was buying it, like Britain had already shaken its old stuffy image off and repackaged itself as this vibrant new Britain. So in the end, Cool Britannia was easily co-opted by the new Labour government as a political pawn, and that's exactly where things are going sour. Because here's the bitter irony. While the world was busy falling in love with Britain's new image and fresh energy, the country's actual class system and power structures hadn't changed a bit. Which means problems are still problems when everything is being sugarcoated. Cool Britannia didn't happen because Britain had magically become a better place. It happened because the mix of creativity, frustration, anger, and raw talent finally found a global megaphone, and the government was smart enough to slap Unijack on it and call it progress. Up to this point, the story still looked beautiful. Back then, the social atmosphere was hitting a peak of hope and optimism. But that was a huge illusion people bought into then. Culturally become cool tricked everyone into thinking the social structure had become cool too. But where did things start to feel not right? To answer that, we have to go back to New Labour's economic policies. Under the cover of all this crazy cultural celebration, the government started pushing a quietly disastrous agenda known as light touch regulation. And the reason this was such a disaster is that it was basically a blank check handed straight to the city of London, which was a goal of turning London into a world-class financial center. Officially, they called it light touch regulation. Put bluntly, it means turn a blind eye and let them get on with it. In order to hit its goal, the government took the risk and turned a blind eye to financial danger, letting institutions jack up leverage and play with the increasingly complex financial instruments. The goal was simple: turn London into the world's financial capital by any means necessary. Just 3 days after taking office, Blair gave the Bank of England control over interest rates and set up the FSA. On paper, it looked like a fancy reform, but in reality, he basically handed the keys to an obedient pro-market team. People thought this cultural party was leading them to a brighter future, but in reality, Britain had already planned the first seed of its coming crisis. Under the smoke screen of this cultural excitement, light touch regulation was officially set in motion. This loser regime gave banks huge freedom, letting them decide how risky their assets were, which meant banks were allowed to play referee for themselves. They could slap safe labels on high-risk products like CDOs built from subprime mortgages. With the right label, they only needed a tiny amount of capital to play bets that were many times larger larger. With that level, they could play way above their weight using almost no capital. History has shown again and again, and whenever power and oversight sit in the same hands, abuse gonna knock at your door. This loose capital setup let banks crank that leverage up to ridiculous levels. Basically, regulators give them a no-limit black card, letting banks keep lending more and more without ever being on a hook. This setup also made it easy for banks to keep sugarcoating their subprime loans into some safe, new products magically. It was basically printing money out of thin air, and regulators couldn't control it or simply chose not to. With Blair and Brown repeating every year at the Mansion House dinner that if we don't stay light touch, business will move to New York, the regulators were effectively sidelined. So the result is that from 2000 to 2007, London was basically a paradise for shadow banking. Banks could lend whatever they want to each other, and derivatives hit the trillions almost overnight. With all their regulation freedom behind them, London bankers went on a landing bench. They set their sails across the Atlantic and latched on to the hottest thing around, those notorious US subprime derivatives, the CDOs and MBSs. So British investment banks started buying out huge bundles of US mortgage junk, and somehow the media and the government sold it as financial innovation. The whole country was clapping for the city. What they didn't realize was that these innovation bundles they bought was basically time bombs, and that's the most ironic and fatal turn in the whole story. Back then, interest rates were low everywhere. Investors were starving for anything that gave them a decent return. Subprime CDOs were flashing way higher returns than boring old stuff bonds, and those juicy numbers fried everyone's brain. People just stamped it in, scared of being the only one not making easy money. At the same time, the big bosses at these British banks were treating those 3A ratings like some gospel. If it's 3A, it must be safe, right? They didn't bother noticing that the rating agencies giving out those labels were being paid by the very banks selling the stuff. Banks had way too much faith in the whole light touch regulation thing. They basically assumed that no matter how wild they got, the government would still be the savior because they were too big to fail. Actually, buying bad debt isn't a problem at all. Even today, securitizing and selling package debt is still a common financial tool, but under the strict regulations. Sellers must hold part of the risk, which helps prevent irresponsible lending. But before 2008, oversight was dangerously loose. Banks didn't really know how much junk was inside the products they were buying, and lenders hold zero accountability after selling the loans, which means that London's banks were left holding the bomb when it exploded. So people thought the city was run by super smart elites, the shining brains of New Britain, but in reality, they behaved more like gamblers. Internal reports shows a scary reality. Big banks like RBS, Barclays, and HSBC were stockpiling US products that their own people couldn't even explain. One internal memo literally said that our own people can't describe what it is we are actually buying. Under the glow of Cool Britannia, the whole world bought into the idea that Britain was so cool, clever, and so sophisticated. But that spotlight might be exactly what pushed the elites to take on financial gambles so big and so confusing that even they didn't understand it. And the irony is that they played the role so well, they ended up fooling themselves. So who pays in the end? London's big banks, pension funds, and global investors, the ones buying all that toxic debt, became the final holders of the risk. When the loans defaulted, their assets turned into confetti overnight. Then as these giants started collapsing, the government had to bail them out with taxpayer money. Which means that the public, the people who had nothing to do with any of this, became the ultimate safety net. And just as the system reached its breaking point, the spark that would set off the impaired powder keg finally arrived. In 2008, the US subprime mortgage bubble burst, and the explosion ripped through the global financial system. Under the so-called light touch regulation, British banks had loaded themselves with mountains of American toxic assets like CDOs and MBS. So when US housing prices collapsed, all those fancy investments turned into junk overnight because the houses backing them up were suddenly worth next to nothing. That triggered a huge breakdown in the flow of money, unleashing a financial tsunami. As for why US housing prices crashed so hard and why it shook the world, we'll save that for a future video. One of the biggest victims was RBS, the world's fifth largest bank. It suddenly posted £24 billion in losses and was seconds from bankruptcy. If it collapsed, millions of saving accounts would be at risk. The government had to intervene, injecting up to £45 billion and offering hundreds of billions in guarantees. It turned into the biggest bailout in UK history. Of course, the taxpayers picked up the tab through a massive pile of national debt. And this bill wasn't just about money, it hits people in the gut. Because watching your dreams crash and burn is way worse than never having any in the first place. The cruel irony is that the Britons suddenly realized that the government and the city had spent 10 years bragging about financial innovation, when in reality it was nothing more than a reckless gamble, one so complex that even the dealers didn't fully understand it. What's worse, they had quietly staked the nation's future on that gamble. And when it blew up, ordinary people were the ones forced to clean up the mess and fix all the shit. And that Cool Britannia dream of equal opportunity and a brighter future actually died overnight in 2008. To save the financial system, the government paid a staggering price. And after the Conservatives took office, the priorities shifted overnight. Forget culture or innovation, the next decade was all about relentless austerity. From 2010 onward, more than £300 billion in public spending was cut, and the austerity cuts went straight for society's vital parts. Healthcare, education, and local public services. The NHS was drained to the point of a collapse. Wait times stretched into something almost unlivable. School budgets shrank. Welfare and local councils were gutted. The same public systems that Thatcher had already weakened in the 90s were hit with another round, this time deep enough to be fatal. It felt like Britain had slid right back into a Cool Britannia decline. This time, it was even bleaker, older, and just completely burned out. And from that point on, Britain basically entered the payback arc. That's the reason why the UK feels so stuck. Not because it lacks ideas or innovation or anything like that, but because all this power is spent compensating for the damage already done. For an entire generation, the emotional storyline basically collapsed. Young people suddenly realized that the ladder their parents climbed had been quietly put away. Same salaries as their parents, but a completely different economy squeezed by austerity so much. And that long, grinding frustration deepened class tensions, and a decade later exploded into Brexit. Cool Britannia felt like a dream you didn't want to wake up from. Those songs, when you listen to them today, no longer carry the emotions or ambition they once did. Back then, Britain stood at the center of the dance floor, thinking the future was right there in the lights. And only when you sober up do you see it. The youth and the chances were quietly staked on the table of the gamblers, and completely lost.